Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is HarrisX CEO and founder, Dritan Nesho. Dritan, thank you so much for joining me once again.
Thanks for having me back, Brittany.
You came on yesterday right after the news broke that Donald Trump is a convicted felon, but now you're coming back with some numbers for us on what voters actually think of the verdict. What are they?
So the news team at Forbes and HarrisX got together to do a flash poll overnight. Over 1,000 voters across the country reacting to yesterday's story. And I would say that the big takeaway, there are several big takeaways, but the biggest one is that it hasn't changed the nature of the race or the horse race at all. When we look at our question, who would you vote for, Biden or Trump, or are you unsure? Trump is at 43%, Biden is at 42%, and about 14% say that they're unsure or don't know. So the race is still a toss up, right? And we've seen for several months now the numbers moving up a few points in one direction, down a few points in another direction, and so forth. So, really, no fundamental change to the race, and frankly, no fundamental change on the question of which way do the unsure, the undecided, lean, right? Right now, when we force the undecided to pick whether they lean towards Biden or towards Trump, it's a 50-50 split. Half are going one way, half are going the other way. So even when you factor in the undecideds, the horse race, it's 2 points off with Trump at 51%, Biden at 49%. So it doesn't seem to have changed the dynamic of the race yet. And, so far things seem to be holding fairly steady for both of the candidates.
Dritan, I need to know why here because if you're in politics and your contender is a convicted felon, I mean that is a political gift from God. You would think you would win. It would be an easy race. You're saying voters are unmoved. Is there any indication why?
Well, a lot of voters paid attention to the trial, right? And the numbers suggest that close to two-thirds of the country was paying close attention to this trial. And I think that a lot of the information that came out, or even the expectation that Trump uh, was guilty on the aggregate, right, was already baked into public opinion, was already baked into the decision model or the decision framework that voters are using. So while the news is in and of itself historical and shocking, it doesn't necessarily seem to have moved voters, in part because voters were closely tuned to it and maybe they just expected this outcome.
When we were talking yesterday, we were talking about how this is going to be a race that comes down to the independents, and this isn't going to be the end all be all for them. Instead, this is a piece of a larger puzzle. Is there any indication that this is moving independents one way or another?
Yeah, it seems to have colored the reaction of independents a little bit. And what I mean by that is that up until now, independents were breaking for Trump, or on aggregate by a few points seem to have been breaking for Trump. And as we look at the various questions that we ask around the trial and also the horse race, it now seems like on aggregate the independents are breaking for Biden. And again, these are very small differences, right? So we're talking about a few point differences here and there. Maybe that'll be sustained. Maybe that'll change, right? Maybe after the first impact of this news, and after we're past this news cycle and on to next week when Hunter Biden's federal trial is starting, maybe that will recalibrate, right, and snap back in the way that it used to be before. But right now, we're not seeing fundamental shifts. And again, we asked a series of questions of everyone, and everyone seems to be split, right? We asked, was the trial fair and unbiased, or was it politically motivated? 49% fair and unbiased overall, 51% said politically motivated. The responses tend to be highly partisan. So Republicans, obviously, over 8 in 10 say politically motivated, and Democrats, 8 in 10 say fair and unbiased, but independents are split, 52 to 48%. The other thing that I would say, Brittany, is that there was a big question whether or not these trials should have been held in these heavy democratic jurisdictions, in this case, New York City, right? And whether or not that would be real or perceived bias. Overall, when you ask voters that question, 54% said that they should have been moved to avoid the real or perceived bias. And independents tend to break a little bit on the other side and say it's possible for the jurors to have voted their conscience and to have voted their mind. So it's 54% who said that versus 46% who said the trials should have been moved. But again, these differences are very small, right? And this trial in general has galvanized each of the bases, has divided independents and the rest of the country even further, but the division is roughly equal on both sides, right? So things haven't really changed to what they were before.
I mean, your numbers are suggesting exactly what we've seen as the response from lawmakers. We've seen GOP lawmakers pretty united in their response that this is a rigged judicial process here. It was a rigged trial, a sham outcome. And Democrats have been united in their response that no one is above the law. In the poll, do voters think that Trump is guilty, or does that fall amongst party lines?
So by a small margin, voters think that Trump was guilty. I mean, we asked the question, regardless of what you think of Donald Trump, do you think he's mostly guilty of the crimes that he has just been convicted of in the state of New York, or were these politically motivated charges in a trial held in a democratic jurisdiction, and he was, largely not guilty? 57% say largely guilty or mostly guilty. 43% say largely not guilty. And again, the partisan splits are fascinating, right? 81% of Republicans say not guilty, 20% say guilty, 91% of Democrats say guilty, 10% say not guilty, and independents split 60-40, 60% saying guilty and 40% saying not guilty. Now, what's important is that this was largely expected. In a similar question that we ran 3 weeks ago, 55% expected Trump to be guilty. So when I say that it's already factored into public opinion, that's what I mean. That I think that the decision went by and large in line with the broad expectation of each of the voter groups and voters in general. And that's why it hasn't changed the overall nature of the race or the overall consideration that these voters are making around who they would pick as their next president.
We saw within the past 24 hours since the verdict came out that the verdict really galvanized Trump's base. His campaign said that it was a historic day for them. The donation page crashed after the verdict temporarily, and they raised $34.8 million in small dollar donations less than 24 hours after the verdict, and 29.7% of the donors are new to the platform, according to the campaign. Is there any indication from the poll that this is galvanizing the Biden base in the same way? Maybe disenfranchised Democrats who are going to sit this election out, not turn out, deciding, hey, I need to get off my couch, I need to vote because I don't want a convicted felon to be the president.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of signals that show that it's galvanizing both bases, but roughly by equal amounts, I would say. And in the all important question of, does the verdict make you more or less likely to vote for Donald Trump in November, or does the verdict have no impact on your vote? The numbers are roughly split again. 30% said more likely to vote for Trump, 27% said less likely to vote for Trump, and 44% said no impact on my vote. This is amongst all the voters. When you look at Republicans, 57% said more likely to vote for Trump, 11% less likely to vote for Trump, and about a third said no impact on my vote. Democrats, you almost flip it. 10% said more likely to vote for Trump. So Trump's got some traction, I guess, with the Democratic base, as Biden does with the Republican base at the 10% level. 41% said less likely to vote for Trump. 48% said no impact on my vote. And independents broke a little bit uh, with less likely to vote for Trump, 28%, more likely 22%, and 51% said no impact on my vote. But again, these differences are small, and that's why they're not changing the horse race. Or maybe they've changed the horse race from Trump being ahead of Biden 3-4 points to now it being a tie, right? Essentially a statistical tie. So, there's very much this phenomenon of Teflon Trump, right? These things are not really impacting his traction with Republicans or really making up the minds of independents. It's another data point for independents. They don't like it. They think that being a convicted felon isn't a good thing for the president. But is this the reason why they will be picking a president or not? It's unlikely. It's unlikely that it will be on this specific.
When you look at this poll about Trump's verdict and the reaction to it 24 hours after, was there anything interesting, any takeaways when you look at it based on demographic?
Well, I think that we had some interesting questions that we formulated together with the news team at Forbes. So they're less about demographic differences where things are roughly falling in line or with expectations, and much more about the reaction to this verdict compared to the previous verdict, right? That Trump received in the civil case, the sexual assault case that E.J. Carroll put forward. And so we asked the question, do you think this felony verdict on business falsification charges, the hush money verdict, is worse than the civil case in which Trump was found guilty of sexual assault? Or do you think that civil case was worse? 48% said the felony verdict is worse. 52% said the sexual assault case is worse. And that holds roughly consistently. And when we ask which label do you think is more damaging to Donald Trump, 59% said actually convicted sexual assaulter is a worse label than convicted felon, which was 41%. So again, Trump, there's so many cases, and the public has been inundated with so many of these legal cases that it has created almost a level of sensitivity towards them. And they're sticking more to issues-based decisions than to these character-based decisions. At the end of the day, a majority of the country doesn't like either Biden or Trump. So this election doesn't seem to be unfolding and playing out on the basis of personality and character. It's unfolding and playing out on the basis of issues. Therefore, we see a lot more resistance to the public moving on news topics or news events like the one we just went through with the felony conviction, and a lot more on issue-based news.
That's really interesting. So, as we've said, the presidential election is in 5 months. This has already been baked in, but it's going to be even more so in 5 months from now. And there's going to be countless news cycles from now and then, many events to unfold until November. So you're saying this will just be a flashpoint. This is not the main story for the election.
Yeah, I think that this will move some segments of voters. So, of course, when we ask more or less likely to vote for Trump, women tend to say, less likely by a 5-point margin. For men, it doesn't matter. In fact, they're saying more likely after this conviction. 18 to 34-year-old, the younger voter groups are saying less likely by 17 points to vote for Trump, so 40% less likely to vote for him, 23% more likely. But the other groups, 35 to 49-year-olds, 50 to 64-year-olds, and 65 plus, they're basically saying more likely to vote for Trump, right? These are voter groups that are not being moved by this news. And I think that the polling that will come out, we're the first to come out with our flash poll, but there will be, I'm sure, many other polls, really should be looked at closely to see where there is resistance, where voter groups are making up their minds on other issues or on other topics, versus where we see, fungibility, right, or where we see this news move the dial. Right now, it's very few groups that are really moving on this news. Some younger voters, some female voters, but it's yet to be seen whether or not this is sustained.
Well, Dritan, as those numbers come out, I'm sure you and I will have many conversations breaking them down. Per usual, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.